The desert night was cruel in its silence, as if the stars themselves had abandoned her to fate. She sat on the hard ground, wrists bound with rawhide, ankles blistered from where the ropes cut into her skin. Her body ached with exhaustion, but it was her spirit that was the most broken. Dust clung to her lips, and the faint taste of blood reminded her of the beating she had endured before she was thrown down here, left in the care of an Apache warrior who hadn't said a word since. Every breath she drew carried the bitter scent of smoke from a distant fire. She didn't know where she was being taken, nor why she was still alive. In truth, she didn't care anymore. The ache in her chest was heavier than her wounds. Too much had been taken from her, her home burned, her family scattered, her dignity crushed. Survival seemed less like a blessing and more like a cruel prolonging of pain. So when the Apache crouched nearby, watching her with those dark, unblinking eyes, she lifted her head with a defiance born not of strength, but of surrender. Her voice cracked, weak yet sharp as a blade. Just kill me fast. The words hung in the air, raw and naked. There was no trembling plea, no tears spilling down her cheeks, only exhaustion, only the quiet request of someone too tired to fight, too broken to hope. Death, she thought, would be easier than the unknown that awaited her. Death, at least, would be her choice. She expected him to react, to sneer, to raise his weapon, to grant her wish with a swift strike. But he did nothing. He didn't even flinch. The Apache simply studied her, his face carved in stone, the firelight catching on the hard lines of his jaw. His silence was more unnerving than any threat could have been. Her heart began to pound. Why wouldn't he answer? Was he toying with her, drawing out her torment? She clenched her fists against the rope until her nails cut into her palms, fighting against the helplessness rising inside her chest. The warrior shifted at last, but not in the way she expected. He did not draw a knife to end her suffering, nor a rope to drag her away. Instead, he reached for something strapped to his horse's saddle. A worn leather sack, its surface dark with age and patched in places, hung heavily in his grip. The sight of it sent a shiver crawling across her skin. Her breath caught as he set it down before her with careful hands. It wasn't the gesture of a killer. No. It was something far stranger, far heavier, as though whatever rested inside that sack held more power than a weapon ever could. She couldn't explain why, but her instincts screamed that the sack mattered. She almost repeated her request for death, but the words died on her lips. The Apache was untangling the knots that held it shut. The motion was deliberate, ritual-like, as though every knot undone was unlocking something far older than the man himself. And in that moment, she realized something more terrifying than the thought of dying. He wasn't going to kill her. No, he had other plans. The sack opened, and though she could not yet see its contents, the air seemed to change, thickening, pressing against her chest, as though time itself had paused to bear witness. Her request for death suddenly seemed small, foolish even, compared to whatever was about to come spilling out into the world. The Apache warrior did not move quickly. Every shift of his body, every flicker of his eyes, carried the weight of someone who had no need to hurry. His silence pressed against her like a physical force. She had demanded her own death, offered him the easy way out of whatever duty bound him to keep her alive. And yet, he refused to give even the courtesy of an answer. His gaze was steady, unblinking. Those dark eyes held none of the cruelty she expected, nor the compassion she secretly wished for. Instead, they reflected something else entirely. A depth she could not measure, an unreadable stillness that unsettled her more than raised weapons ever could. For a long moment, neither moved. She squirmed beneath his stare, the ropes biting deeper into her wrists as she shifted her weight. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked, but she dared not speak again. The first time she had spoken, he had left her words hanging in the air, unanswered. To speak again felt dangerous, as though she might shatter something fragile in the silence between them. The desert wind swept across the camp, carrying grains of sand that stung her skin. Still, he sat motionless, his form outlined against the flickering glow of the fire. His hair, dark and heavy, fell loosely across his shoulders. His chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of a man untroubled by her presence. Or perhaps, a man who was measuring her in ways she couldn't fathom. She tried to make sense of him. Why keep her alive? Why refuse her request? 100 possibilities twisted in her mind. Perhaps he wanted her to suffer longer. Perhaps she was being kept as some kind of trade. Or perhaps, she thought bitterly, he simply didn't care enough to end her life. But then, the way his eyes lingered on her face contradicted that thought. It wasn't indifference. It was attention, focused, deliberate, as if he saw something she couldn't see in herself. That realization unsettled her most of all. Minutes dragged on like hours. The fire cracked and popped, filling the silence with small bursts of sound. But he never spoke. At last, she broke under the weight of it. "What do you want from me?" Her voice was hoarse, trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. Still, no answer. Only the faintest tightening of his jaw, as though the words reached him but did not deserve his tongue. He shifted at last, but not toward her. Instead, his hand rested briefly on the sack he had set beside him, the worn leather glowing faintly in the firelight. Her stomach twisted. Whatever was inside that sack, she realized, it mattered more than her life. His silence wasn't just cruelty. It was purpose. He wasn't refusing to answer her out of spite. He was waiting for something only he understood. The weight of that thought pressed down on her until she could hardly breathe. She had asked for death, but perhaps she had asked the wrong man. This was no ordinary warrior. His silence was not the absence of words. It was the presence of something larger, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. She shivered, not from the cold desert air, but from the truth dawning inside her chest. Whatever fate awaited her, it would not come from his blade. It would come from the silence. And the silence was far worse. The Apache's silence had stretched long enough to feel eternal, until at last, he moved. His hand brushed the dirt near his side, steady, unhurried. She flinched despite herself, expecting a weapon to flash, expecting the end she had already begged for. But no blade came. Instead, his fingers curled around the worn strap of the leather sack she had glimpsed earlier. He lifted it with a care that unsettled her. The sack was nothing remarkable at first glance, a simple pouch, patched in places, the leather cracked with age. Yet the way he held it made it seem heavier than steel, as if what rested inside was not just carried but guarded. Her eyes locked onto it. Something about it pulled at her, the way a storm gathers on the horizon and draws all attention to the blackening clouds. It was not fear of death this time, but fear of the unknown. He set the sack down before him, not tossing it carelessly as one might with a bag of tools or food, but lowering it slowly, almost reverently, as though the earth itself might tremble if he were careless. She swallowed, her throat raw, the taste of dust thick on her tongue. "What is that?" she whispered before she could stop herself. No answer. His eyes flicked to hers for a single heartbeat, a glance that silenced her more effectively than a shout ever could. Then, with deliberate fingers, he began to undo the knots binding the sack shut. Each knot came loose with a tug, the leather cords rasping against his hands. The sound was soft, almost insignificant, but it seemed to echo in the quiet desert night. The fire sputtered, shadows bending and twisting as though straining to glimpse what would be revealed. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to look away. She should look away. But she couldn't. Something in the air had shifted. It pressed down against her skin, thick and heavy, until even breathing felt unnatural. The Apache leaned closer to the sack, his long fingers steady as he loosened the last knot. The flap of leather fell open, and a faint smell escaped. Dry earth, smoke, and something sharper, like flint, struck against stone. Her skin prickled. She strained to see. Inside the sack were shapes she could not yet make out, but even hidden in shadows, she felt their presence like a weight pressing against her bones. The Apache's face did not change. His silence was no longer just unsettling. It was ceremonial, as if speaking now would profane the act of revealing what lay within. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to beg him to stop, to shove the sack away, to do anything but open it. Yet she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear her gaze away. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across his face. His features looked harder, almost carved from stone, lit by a glow that seemed too deliberate for mere firelight. The sack's contents remained mostly hidden, but already the world around her felt different, heavier, stranger. Time itself seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. She no longer thought of death. She no longer thought of freedom. The only thing that mattered was the sack and the terrible promise of what it contained. The Apache adjusted his posture, straightening his back as if preparing for something sacred. His hand dipped into the opening. Her breath caught. For the first time since this nightmare began, she realized she had made a mistake. Death would have been easier. Whatever was in that sack. It was meant to change everything. The Apache's hand disappeared into the sack, and though he had not yet drawn anything out, the very act of reaching inside seemed to change the air around them. The desert, which only moments ago had been alive, with the hiss of wind through dry grass and the faint crackle of the fire, grew eerily still. The world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Her skin prickled. Gooseflesh spread down her arms, even though the night was warm. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her chest, too loud, too raw, as if the sound alone might give her away to whatever unseen presence had suddenly awakened. The Apache's movements were deliberate, each one echoing louder in her mind than it should. The soft rasp of his fingers against the leather, the creak of the strap where the bag bent, the faint shifting of objects within. Each sound carried weight, amplified in the silence until it felt like thunder. Her mouth went dry. She wanted to speak, to demand to know what he was doing, but her voice was gone, trapped somewhere behind her pounding pulse. Even if she could have spoken, she wasn't sure she dared. It wasn't just silence now. It was suspension. The fire's flames no longer danced but froze, captured in mid-flicker, their orange tongues unmoving in the night air. The sparks that had been climbing toward the stars seemed halted, glittering motionless, as though time itself had been caught in a snare. She blinked, rubbed her eyes against the rough rope binding her wrists. But it wasn't an illusion. The world was still. Her gaze snapped back to the Apache. He seemed unchanged, unfazed, as though this bending of the world was no surprise to him. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the sack with a focus so intense it frightened her more than any weapon could have. She shifted on the ground, panic clawing up her throat. The rope cut deeper into her skin, the pain sharp and real. And yet it did nothing to break the sensation that everything else had fallen away. She could not hear the wind. She could not feel the desert night. She could not even sense the stars above. All she could feel was the pull of the moment, thick and unnatural, as if she were no longer part of the world she knew. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Was she dying? Had her plea been granted in some twisted form? Perhaps this was the first step into death. Silence, stillness, the fading of time itself. But if this was death, why did the Apache still move, slow and steady, unaffected? No. This was not death. This was something worse. At last, his hand withdrew from the sack. Between his fingers was an object, small and dark, though in the frozen firelight it gleamed faintly as if alive. She could not yet see what it was, but she felt its presence ripple across her skin like heat from an unseen flame. Time had not yet resumed. Her heartbeat thundered against the unbearable stillness, but nothing else moved. It was as if the universe itself was waiting for him to reveal the secret he carried. Her lips parted, a whisper she could not stop escaping them. "What have you done?" For the first time, the Apache's gaze flicked back to her. His eyes held something unfathomable, something that told her this was no trick of firelight or madness. This was real, and when he finally opened his palm to show her what he held, she understood. Time itself had bowed to the weight of it. The Apache slowly brought his hand forward, palm up, and for the first time she saw what he held. It was small but heavy-looking, dark and irregularly shaped, catching the firelight in fleeting glimmers like fragments of night itself. Her stomach twisted. It was not a weapon, at least not in the way she had feared. Inside the sack were objects that seemed impossible, each carrying a weight far beyond its size. There were feathers, black as midnight, smooth and soft, yet holding a rigid spine. Small stones, worn and etched with lines she could not comprehend, glimmered faintly as though holding secrets trapped inside. A few bones, carefully cleaned and polished, lay alongside the stones, delicate yet undeniably powerful. And there was an obsidian blade, dark as a shadow, its surface etched with strange markings that shimmered faintly, hinting at some hidden energy. She gasped involuntarily. The items were not mere objects. They were relics, talismans, tools of something sacred and dangerous. They seemed to hum in her chest, vibrating faintly, sending a chill down her spine. The air around her thickened, heavy and charged, like the calm before a storm. Her fear shifted, twisting into something more complex: awe, confusion, and an instinctive understanding that these objects were not meant for casual human hands. She had come expecting death, expecting pain or cruelty, and instead she faced a mystery that dwarfed both. The Apache arranged the items on the ground with meticulous care. Each feather was laid with the quill pointing toward the center, the stones circled around it in a precise pattern. The bones were placed as if forming a language she could not read. Finally, he positioned the obsidian blade atop the arrangement, its edges catching the firelight, gleaming with a cold, almost liquid sharpness. Her eyes followed every movement, trying to memorize the arrangement, but it was impossible. She felt as though she were witnessing a ritual older than the earth itself. The wind remained still. The fire remained frozen. Time, it seemed, had surrendered to the gravity of this moment. Then the Apache touched the blade lightly with his fingertips, tracing the etched markings with reverence. A soft hum rose from the object, barely audible, yet it resonated inside her skull. She flinched as visions flashed behind her eyes, rivers of fire, shadowed forests, animals she had never seen moving in patterns she could not comprehend. The images came and went in a blink, leaving her disoriented and trembling. The realization struck her like a blow. This was not just about her or the world she knew. These objects carried power, ancient and dangerous, bound to forces she could not name. She was not a witness to violence, but to something far greater, a force that demanded attention, demanded respect, demanded her awe. The Apache remained calm, almost meditative. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, performing gestures she could not understand, speaking words she could not hear, words older than memory. And through it all, he never looked at her in the way one might look at a captive. There was no malice, no cruelty. Only the measured patience of someone who understood the magnitude of what they held. She realized then that her fear of death was trivial compared to the terror of understanding too little, too late. These objects, these sacred relics, could change everything, or destroy everything, if misused. And the Apache, with his silent command over the moment, held the key to both. Her throat tightened. She had asked to die quickly, and now she wondered if surviving was far worse. Because to live, she would have to confront the unknown, the impossible, and a destiny she could not escape. And as she stared, frozen, the obsidian blade caught a final flicker of firelight, and she felt, deep in her bones, that this moment would mark the beginning of everything, not the end. Her fear, once sharp and immediate, began to change. It no longer clung to the thought of death. Instead, it shifted into a deeper, more complex emotion, one she could not name. The objects before her, feathers, stones, bones, and the obsidian blade, seemed alive, charged with a force that pulsed faintly in the air. They were not merely relics. They were carriers of ancient power, and her presence near them felt dangerous. She had expected the Apache to kill her, to treat her as a threat or as property. Yet here he was, performing a ritual, moving with deliberate care, revealing to her the contents of the sack as though testing her spirit rather than her body. Every motion he made carried a significance she could not comprehend, and it unsettled her far more than a raised weapon ever could. Her pulse raced as she realized she was witnessing something sacred, something that had been hidden from outsiders for generations. The way he traced the symbols on the obsidian blade, the placement of the bones and stones, the careful alignment of feathers, each gesture was deliberate, almost reverent. It was clear that this was a ceremony, a communion with forces beyond. Her understanding, and she was not meant to intervene, yet she could not look away. Her fear grew alongside a strange, reluctant curiosity. What were these objects? What did the Apache hope to accomplish? And most importantly, why had he spared her life to witness this moment? As she watched, the air seemed to thrum with energy. A faint warmth spread through her body, tingling at her skin, threading through her veins. She shivered, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity of what she was experiencing. The desert night had transformed. The wind, the stars, even the fire, all felt heightened, alive with a strange consciousness that pulsed in rhythm with the ritual. She realized that the fear she had known, the fear of pain, of torture, of death, was primitive, immediate, and fleeting compared to this. This was fear of the unknown, fear of forces that could not be predicted, understood, or controlled. She felt small, fragile, and powerless, standing on the threshold of something vast and ancient. The Apache spoke for the first time since unveiling the sack, but his words were not directed at her. They were low, soft, more like whispers to the wind than to a human listener. She could not understand them, yet somehow she sensed their importance. The cadence, the rhythm, the weight of each word conveyed meaning beyond language. A declaration, a warning, a guiding hand pointing toward fate itself. Her gaze shifted nervously between him and the objects, each moment intensifying the awareness that she was witnessing not a ritual for herself, but for the world around her. She had survived violence and betrayal, but she had never survived the impossible. And now, she realized, she was part of something larger, something that demanded her attention, her respect, and perhaps even her obedience. A slow realization settled in her chest. She was no longer just a captive, trembling before a warrior who could end her life. She was a witness to a force older than human memory, and she was being judged, measured, and tested in ways she could barely comprehend. Her fear had shifted from wanting an end to fearing what lay ahead. Death had been simple, predictable. This was far worse. A destiny she could not flee, a knowledge she could not unlearn, and a presence that seemed to bend reality itself around the Apache's deliberate, careful hands. She swallowed, her throat tight, heart pounding. Whatever came next would define her, not as a victim, but as someone entwined with powers she could not yet name, powers that were about to change her life forever. The desert air remained still, thick with an almost tangible energy that pressed against her chest. The fire's glow seemed frozen, the shadows it cast unmoving, and the stars above shone as though captured behind glass. Time, she realized, had not returned. It lingered suspended, attentive, as if watching the ritual unfold alongside her. Her eyes were fixed on the Apache as he moved with steady precision, his fingers tracing the intricate markings on the obsidian blade. The feathers, stones and bones were arranged perfectly, their positions radiating a symmetry that defied explanation. As he worked, a low hum seemed to emanate from the objects themselves, vibrating through the air and resonating inside her skull. And then it began. Images, fleeting and fragmented, flickered behind her closed eyelids. She saw rivers of fire winding through dark forests under a sky that glowed green and gold. Shadows of animals she had never seen moved with impossible grace. Enormous birds with feathers like molten metal. Creatures with eyes that glimmered like gemstones. The visions were not static. They pulsed, shifting and merging, as though the world itself was being rewritten before her very eyes. She stumbled backward, trying to catch her breath, but the energy in the air held her in place. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears, louder than the last. The visions intensified, filling her mind, overwhelming her senses. She saw herself standing beside the Apache in another life, a life she could not remember, yet felt intimately tied to. The scene shifted again. She was running across barren plains, the wind tearing at her hair, yet she felt neither fear nor pain, only a strange, intoxicating clarity. Her thoughts tumbled in a chaotic spiral. Was this magic, a hallucination, or something more profound, a glimpse into the threads of fate itself? She had been prepared to die, had begged for a quick release from the cruelty of the world, yet here she was, suspended between reality and something far stranger, more terrifying, and infinitely more powerful. The Apache's chanting continued, low and measured, almost melodic. She could not understand the words, yet their rhythm seemed to guide the visions, shaping them, giving them coherence in a way that defied human understanding. Every movement of his hand over the objects, every breath he drew seemed to ripple through the visions, pulling them into sharper focus. Her fear began to mingle with something else, awe, curiosity, even a reluctant sense of wonder. These images, impossible and vivid, hinted at forces far older and greater than herself, forces that she had no right to comprehend but could not look away from. She realized she was standing at the threshold of knowledge and power, caught between the world she had known and a reality that defied everything she had ever believed. She felt the weight of her own mortality, her smallness in the face of forces she could barely imagine. And yet, paradoxically, she felt connected, as if the visions were calling to something deep within her, unlocking memories and instincts she had never consciously known. The hum of the objects, the stillness of the desert, and the intensity of the Apache's gaze combined into a moment that seemed to stretch forever. She could not look away. She could not speak. She could not act. All she could do was witness. And in that silence, in that suspended time, she understood that her life had changed irreversibly. Death had not come for her. Instead, she had been drawn into something far greater, far older, and far more powerful than herself. Whatever lay ahead would demand courage she did not yet possess, and wisdom she had yet to learn. The visions were not merely a spectacle. They were a calling, a warning, and a promise, all at once. She opened her eyes and the desert seemed to shift slightly, as though reality itself had exhaled. The Apache looked at her then, his gaze holding the weight of everything she had just seen, and for the first time, she felt that she might survive, but only if she understood the impossible. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as if the desert itself had paused to hear the Apache's words. She had spent hours, or was it minutes, witnessing the visions, suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside time. Her heart was still racing, her mind struggling to comprehend the images she had just seen. Every instinct screamed to flee, to demand answers, to seek refuge in some form of certainty. Then he spoke. His voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of generations, as if each word had been practiced and preserved through centuries. It was not loud, but it filled the stillness of the desert, threading through her thoughts, pressing against her consciousness like a physical force. "Death will not come for you yet," he said, his gaze steady on her, unwavering. "The spirits decide." The words struck her with the force of a storm. She had begged for release, for an end to her suffering, and now she understood that her plea had not been granted. The Apache was not her executioner. He was something else entirely, a gatekeeper, a mediator, a keeper of forces she could barely comprehend. Her throat went dry. She wanted to respond, to ask why, to demand understanding, but the words would not form. She could only stare, awestruck, as he continued. "They have seen your fear. They have seen your heart. You have been judged." The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the hard lines of his jaw, the depth of his eyes. There was no cruelty there, no triumph, only the calm authority of someone who understood the fragile boundary between life and death, between the mortal world and forces far older and greater. He gestured to the objects on the ground, the feathers, stones, bones, and obsidian blade. "These are not mere tools," he said. "They carry the weight of the spirits. They reveal truths that few can bear to witness. They test those who encounter them." Her mind reeled. She had thought herself a victim, a powerless captive, but now she realized she was part of something much larger. The visions had been a test, a glimpse into forces that had long been hidden from human eyes. She had survived not because of luck, or cunning, or strength, but because the spirits had chosen to grant her this moment. "But why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am nothing. I am lost. I have asked only for death." He shook his head slowly, the motion deliberate, as though correcting a misconception as ancient as the desert itself. "No one is nothing. Every life carries weight. Every soul has a purpose, even when it is hidden from itself. You have been brought here for a reason you do not yet understand." Her fear, still lingering, shifted again, this time mingling with a tentative sense of hope. She was no longer merely at the mercy of this warrior. She was being guided, chosen to witness, to learn, perhaps even to act. But the magnitude of it terrified her. The spirits, the ritual, the visions, they were not simple, and they were not forgiving. The Apache's gaze softened slightly, though his authority remained unbroken. "The path ahead will not be easy. You will face trials you cannot yet imagine, but you will not face them alone. You have been given a gift, and with it, a responsibility." Her heart thundered in her chest. The fear of death had been replaced by a far deeper fear, the fear of what she must now become. The world she had known was gone, replaced by a reality that defied comprehension, a destiny she could neither escape nor ignore. And in that moment, she understood the truth. Survival was no longer about escaping pain. It was about embracing the impossible, standing firm in the face of forces that could bend time and spirit alike, and finding a courage she did not yet know she possessed. The Apache's words hung in the air, echoing long after he had finished speaking. She was no longer merely a captive. She was part of something far greater, bound to forces she could barely comprehend, and her life, her very soul, would never be the same. The firelight flickered across the desert, casting long, restless shadows over the sand, yet the oppressive weight of silence remained. She sat on the ground, wrists still bound, but her perception of the Apache had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer just her captor, no longer merely a figure of threat and danger. He was something else entirely. A keeper of secrets, a mediator between mortal life and forces she could barely comprehend. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had changed. The raw terror of imminent death had been replaced by a quiet, pervasive awe. She had glimpsed the visions, felt the pulse of ancient power through the objects in the sack, and heard the Apache's words. She understood now that her life was not hers alone, that fate had placed her in this moment for reasons she could not yet grasp. And in that understanding, a strange bond began to form between them. It was not born of trust. Not yet. Trust required time, and she had learned that time here moved differently. It was a bond of shared knowledge, of shared witness. He had allowed her to see what few could ever see. He had spared her life when she had asked for death, and in doing so, he had acknowledged her presence, her potential, her importance in a narrative that extended far beyond the boundaries of her understanding. Her mind raced, trying to process it all. She had been a captive, yes, but she had not been treated like prey. She had been treated like a participant, like someone whose spirit mattered even in the face of forces she could not name. The objects in the sack, the ritual, the visions, they had all been part of a test, and she had survived. But more than survival, she had been changed. She looked at him now, really looked. The stoic features, the unyielding gaze, the deliberate movements, they no longer represented threat alone. They represented authority tempered with purpose, knowledge tempered with patience. And though he had not spoken directly to her about his intentions, the weight of his presence communicated something unmistakable. She mattered. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of connection, a fragile recognition that he was not simply an obstacle to her survival, but a guide through the unknown. The visions had shown her possibilities, glimpses of other lives, other choices. But it was his actions, his silence, his deliberate restraint that had begun to shape the reality she now faced. She shifted slightly, still cautious, still aware of her vulnerability, yet unable to suppress a flicker of gratitude. Not for mercy alone, but for clarity. Clarity that had come through the most terrifying of trials. She realized that the bond forming between them was one of understanding, a recognition that life, death, and power were intertwined in ways she could not yet fully grasp. And he acknowledged it in the simplest of ways. A slight nod as he arranged the objects once more, a measured pause, a gesture of consideration rather than command. Each movement communicated respect, the kind of respect reserved for those who had proven themselves worthy of witnessing truths few could bear. She realized then that this bond was both a gift and a responsibility. She was not merely a witness to the rituals, nor merely a captive in the desert night. She was entwined with him, with the objects, with the forces that had paused time itself to test her. Survival was no longer her own choice. It was a shared journey, one in which she had a role to play. Her fear, her awe, and her curiosity coalesced into a tentative determination. She would not fully trust him, not yet, but she would pay attention, learn, and endure. The connection between them, strange and fragile, had become her anchor. For the first time since she had been thrown into this world of terror and mystery, she realized she was not completely alone, and in that recognition, a new kind of strength began to take root. A strength forged not in weapons or blood, but in shared witness, understanding, and the unspoken bond between two souls standing on the threshold of the impossible. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting a molten, glow over the desert that painted the sand in golds and reds. The firelight flickered, though it no longer carried the unnatural stillness that had gripped the night. Time, it seemed, had returned. Yet everything felt different, as though the world had subtly shifted in her absence. She could breathe, again, but the weight of what she had witnessed lingered in her chest like a stone. The Apache closed the sack slowly, his movements deliberate, ritualistic. Each fold, each tug of the leather, carried the authority of someone who understood the delicate balance between mortal life and forces older than memory. He placed it beside him, untouched now, as if it had served its purpose for the night. She watched, heart still racing, trying to process the cascade of events that had unfolded. The visions, the ritual, the inexplicable power of the objects. They were beyond comprehension, yet they had been hers to witness. And though she had survived, she knew survival was only the beginning. Something had been set in motion tonight, and she could feel its pull already tugging at her very soul. The Apache's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was a hint of something beyond authority or restraint, almost like understanding. He did not speak, yet the silence carried meaning. He had spared her life, revealed truths, and tested her spirit. But he had not promised safety. That was not his role. That responsibility rested with forces she had only begun to glimpse. Her mind whirled with questions, with fear, with a cautious spark of hope. She had asked for death, but death had been denied. Instead, she had been given a fate far stranger, more profound, and infinitely more terrifying. The world she had known was gone. In its place stretched a reality that was ancient, alive, and relentless in its demands. The desert wind whispered over the dunes, carrying with it a sense of movement, of destiny shifting. She felt it in her bones, in the tightening of her chest, in the unsteady rhythm of her heartbeat. Whatever lay ahead would test her courage, her wits, and her very soul. She was no longer merely surviving. She was being drawn into something larger, into a story she could not yet understand. The Apache rose from the sand, the sack secured on his back, his movements calm, controlled, purposeful. He glanced at her once more, a silent acknowledgement that she was part of what had just unfolded, that her role was far from over. Then, without a word, he mounted his horse and disappeared into the shifting gold of the desert, leaving her alone with the echoes of visions, the residue of fear, and the faint hum of power still lingering in the air. She remained seated, wrists sore and bloodied, eyes fixed on the horizon where he had vanished. For a long moment she did not move, her mind racing with the weight of what she had witnessed. She realized, with a chill creeping down her spine, that the night had changed her irrevocably. She could never go back to the life she had known. It had ended the moment the sack had opened. The desert seemed to exhale around her, settling into the normal rhythms of wind and firelight, yet the pulse of the impossible remained. She knew, deep in her bones, that she had been chosen, or at least noticed, by forces beyond comprehension. And she also knew that her survival had a purpose. Her request for death had been denied. Instead, she was left with the weight of knowledge, the burden of destiny, and the uncertainty of what was to come. The shadows of the desert lengthened, and as night crept in once more, she felt the first flicker of determination ignite within her. She would endure, she would learn, and she would face the unknown. But even as she stood, brushing sand from her clothes, one thought refused to leave her mind. The Apache had opened the sack. Time itself had paused, and now, whatever had been released would not rest. The desert held its breath once again, waiting for the story to continue, waiting for her next move.